In 1918, Germany lost a war. But what followed was something far worse than defeat. It wasn't the destruction of cities or the collapse of an army. It was a financial sentence designed to last longer than the people who signed it, longer than the politicians who celebrated it, longer than anyone alive at the time could possibly imagine. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just punish Germany for World War I. It engineered a trap. Germany was ordered to pay reparations so massive they weren't meant to be repaid quickly. They were meant to reshape the future. The number was staggering, an amount so large it could not be paid from current income, only rolled forward, restructured, refinanced, and carried like a permanent weight. At first, people believed it was temporary, a painful chapter, but one that would eventually close. Governments always say that. They talk about recovery, rebuilding, moving on, but debt doesn't move on. It waits. To meet those obligations, Germany did what governments always do when reality collides with promises. It borrowed, it printed, it pushed the cost forward, and every decision made to survive the present quietly poisoned the future. By the early 1920s, the system cracked. Hyperinflation wasn't an accident. It wasn't chaos. It was a predictable result of trying to pay impossible debts with collapsing money. Savings evaporated. Middle-class families watched lifetime wealth disappear in months. A loaf of bread cost more at night than it did in the morning. People weren't just losing money. They were losing trust. That loss of trust didn't vanish when the currency stabilized. It sank deeper. Then came restructuring. New plans, new schedules, new promises. The Dawes Plan, the Young Plan. Each one presented as a solution, each one extending the timeline. Germany wasn't escaping the debt. It was learning how to live with it. World War II came and went. Borders changed. Regimes fell. Flags changed. Governments collapsed. Entire ideologies rose and died. And still, the debt survived. That's the part most people never hear. After the war, the obligations didn't disappear. They were frozen, paused, delayed, but never erased. Interest continued to exist in the background, waiting for the right moment to return. And it did. In 1953, the London Debt Agreement restructured Germany's remaining obligations. It reduced them, yes, but it also locked part of the payments into the future, to be resumed only after reunification. At the time, reunification seemed impossible. East and West Germany felt permanent. The Cold War froze history in place. It looked like a clever compromise. Delay the cost into a future that might never arrive. But history doesn't stay frozen forever. When Germany reunified in 1990, the clock restarted. Quietly, bureaucratically. No headlines, no public debate, just payments resuming, tied to a war that had ended before most Germans were born. Those payments continued until 2010. 92 years after World War I ended, Germany made its final reparation-related payment. Think about that. Children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren paid for a decision made by people they would never meet. Not through choice, through structure. This isn't just a story about Germany. It's a lesson about how debt doesn't end when wars end. It ends when the last payment clears. And by then, the damage has already shaped generations. Long-term debt doesn't just drain money. It rewires behavior. Once a country is locked into obligations that span decades, every decision starts bending around that reality. Not openly, not honestly, quietly. Budgets become political theater. Growth projections become optimistic by necessity. Inflation stops being feared and starts being tolerated, sometimes even welcomed. Germany's interwar years are the clearest example of this distortion. To service reparations, the government needed revenue it didn't have. Raising taxes too aggressively risked revolt. Cutting spending threatened collapse. So the pressure moved elsewhere, into the currency, into credit, into time itself. Debt pushed policymakers toward choices that looked manageable in the short term and destructive in the long term. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s destroyed trust not only in money, but in institutions. When a government proves it can erase savings overnight, people don't forget. They adapt. They speculate. They hoard assets. They stop believing stability is real. That psychological scar didn't vanish when inflation was brought under control. It shaped how Germans viewed money for generations. Risk aversion, obsession with fiscal discipline, deep fear of currency collapse. These weren't cultural quirks. They were learned responses to a system that failed publicly and painfully. But the trap didn't stop at psychology. It spread into politics. Debt narrowed the range of acceptable choices. Leaders couldn't simply prioritize growth or social stability. Every path had to pass through the constraint of repayment. And when a nation feels cornered long enough, it starts listening to voices that promise escape at any cost. That's not an excuse. It's a mechanism. Economic suffocation creates political extremism the same way pressure creates fractures in stone. Slowly, invisibly, until suddenly everything breaks. After World War II, Germany tried to do the opposite. Stability became sacred. Inflation was treated as a moral failure, not just an economic one. And on the surface, that worked. Growth returned. Trust was rebuilt. The economy became one of the strongest in the world. But underneath, the old debt never fully disappeared. The London Debt Agreement didn't erase the past. It deferred part of it. Payments were linked to reunification, a future event that seemed abstract, distant, almost hypothetical, that made the burden feel unreal. Out of sight, politically convenient. And that's how long debt survives. Not by being unbearable all at once, but by being postponed, diluted, and passed forward. When reunification finally happened, it was celebrated as a triumph of history. But it also triggered obligations most people didn't even know existed. Payments resumed not because of public debate or democratic choice, but because of agreements signed generations earlier. No protest, no outrage, just compliance. That's the quiet power that stretched across time. It stops feeling like theft and starts feeling like gravity. Something that's always been there, something no one questions. By the time Germany made its final payment in 2010, the costs had been normalized, folded into budgets, hidden in line items, detached from the original war entirely. But normalization doesn't mean neutrality. Every euro paid toward that obligation was a euro not spent elsewhere, not invested, not saved, not chosen. Debt doesn't need to destroy a country outright to shape its destiny. It just needs to stay long enough. And that's the real lesson. Not that Germany was punished, but that once debt survives long enough, it stops being a policy and becomes a condition of existence. Most people assume debt ends when the crisis ends, when the war is over, when the economy recovers, when peace treaties are signed and history moves on. But debt doesn't follow events. It follows contracts. World War I ended in 1918. The political order collapsed. Borders were redrawn. Empires disappeared. Entire governments ceased to exist. And yet the debt remained, untouched by revolutions, immune to time, legally alive long after the people who created it were dead. That's what makes long-term sovereign debt different from anything else. It doesn't care who pays, only that someone does. Germany's reparations evolved, restructured, renamed, and renegotiated dozens of times. What began as punishment slowly transformed into obligation. What began as accountability turned into inheritance. By the time the final payments were being made, no one alive had voted for the war. No one had approved the treaties. No one had benefited from the original borrowing or destruction. And yet the bill still arrived. This is where debt stops being economic and becomes generational. A child born in post-war Germany grew up, worked, paid taxes, raised a family, and unknowingly helped service a war fought by his grandparents. Not because of guilt, not because of responsibility, but because the system recognizes continuity of obligation, not continuity of consent. Debt survives regime change because it's written to. Governments fall. Currencies change. Constitutions are rewritten. But obligations remain enforceable as long as a legal successor exists. That's why default is treated as heresy. A country can change its flag, rewrite its laws, even change its name, but the moment it questions its debt, it's framed as unstable, dangerous, untrustworthy. Creditworthiness becomes more sacred than sovereignty. And this isn't unique to Germany. Every major conflict of the modern era left behind financial obligations that outlived the event itself. Wars ended. Reconstruction began. Growth returned. But the debts continued quietly in the background, shaping fiscal policy long after the headlines faded. What changes over time isn't the debt. It's how invisible it becomes. Long-term debt doesn't feel like a burden because it's amortized across decades. Payments become predictable, manageable, forgettable, and that's exactly the point. A debt that shocks invites resistance. A debt that fades into normalcy invites obedience. By spreading the cost across generations, systems avoid accountability in the present. No single group feels robbed enough to revolt. No single year looks catastrophic. The damage is cumulative, not explosive. And because the debt is stable, the system is praised for responsibility. But stability can be deceptive. When a nation spends decades prioritizing obligation over opportunity, the cost isn't always visible in crisis. It appears in slower growth, deferred investment, political caution, a permanent preference for safety over experimentation. Germany rebuilt successfully, but always under constraint. Fiscal discipline wasn't just policy. It was trauma encoded into governance, and trauma shapes behavior long after the original threat disappears. By 2010, when the last payment was finally made, it wasn't a headline. There were no parades, no public reckoning, just a quiet transfer that closed a file opened 92 years earlier. That silence is the most revealing part. Debt that lasts long enough stops being questioned. It becomes history's background noise. And when people stop questioning, systems learn they can repeat the pattern, not by conquering territory, but by conquering time. By the time Germany finished paying for World War I, the lesson had already been absorbed by every major financial institution on the planet. Debt that never truly ends is the most powerful form of control, not because it destroys nations overnight, but because it reshapes priorities slowly, quietly, permanently. After the war, Germany didn't just owe money. It owed predictability, stability, compliance. Its fiscal decisions were no longer purely domestic. They had to account for creditors, treaties, and reputational risk. Every budget became a negotiation with the past. Modern systems took note. Today, debt is no longer framed as a temporary response to crisis. It's built into the structure of governance itself. Governments don't plan to eliminate debt. They plan to manage it, roll it over, refinance it, push it forward. Debt isn't a problem to solve. It's a condition to maintain. This shift changes everything. When a government expects debt to exist forever, policy becomes reactive rather than visionary. Long-term investments are judged not by social value, but by how they affect credit ratings. Political courage is filtered through bond markets. Growth is acceptable as long as it doesn't threaten the repayment schedule. The system doesn't reward innovation. It rewards reliability. And reliability means predictability. Predictable taxpayers. Predictable inflation. Predictable compliance. That's why inflation is tolerated, even welcomed. Inflation reduces the real value of debt without triggering default. It allows obligations to be paid with weaker currency while maintaining the illusion of responsibility. Creditors receive their payments. Governments avoid collapse. And citizens absorb the cost through reduced purchasing power. No announcement is required. No vote is taken. The transfer happens silently. This is a legacy of long-duration debt. It taught the system that people will tolerate almost anything as long as it happens gradually, that resistance fades when pain is diffused across time. Germany's 92-year obligation wasn't an anomaly, it was a prototype. Today, most citizens are born into systems where debt already exists and will still exist when they die. National debt isn't discussed as something to eliminate, only something to sustain. The numbers grow so large they lose meaning. Trillions become abstract. Interest becomes background noise. But abstraction doesn't mean harmless. Permanent debt changes the relationship between citizens and the state. Taxes stop being a tool for public goods and become a mechanism for servicing obligations. Economic growth becomes less about prosperity and more about avoiding instability. Risk-taking moves upward, while restraint is enforced downward. The state can borrow freely. The individual cannot. And when crises arrive, financial crashes, pandemics, wars, the solution is always the same. More debt, larger deficits, longer timelines. The future will pay for the present. It always does. But here's the critical difference between then and now. Germany's debt came from a visible event, a war everyone could point to, a moment in history with clear cause and consequence. Today's debts are layered, compounded, detached from any single origin. Ask the average citizen what their country's debt is for, and the answer is unclear. Decades of spending decisions blurred together. No single war, no single crisis, just accumulation. And accumulation is harder to resist because it feels normal. By the time the weight becomes obvious, the system is already optimized to preserve itself. Any attempt to reduce debt is framed as dangerous. Austerity sparks unrest. Default invites punishment. Reform threatens collapse. So the cycle continues. Not because no one understands the risk, but because the system was designed to prefer endless payment over resolution. And once debt becomes permanent, freedom becomes conditional. Germany didn't finish paying for World War I in 2010 because the war lasted that long. It finished paying because debt, once accepted, rarely disappears. The war ended in 1918. The destruction stopped. Borders were redrawn. Governments fell. Entire ideologies collapsed. But the obligation remained, passed down quietly from one generation to the next. People who had never seen the war still paid for it. People who had never voted for it. People who had nothing to do with its causes or its consequences. They inherited the bill. That's the final stage of the trap, when debt stops belonging to the past and becomes part of the future's foundation. And this is where the story stops being about Germany. Today, entire populations are born into systems already defined by obligations they didn't create. National debt isn't a temporary emergency measure anymore. It's a permanent feature of modern governance. It shapes policy, limits options, and defines what is politically possible. The most important decisions are no longer made in parliaments alone. They're made in response to markets, to interest rates, to investor confidence, to credit agencies. The system doesn't ask what's best for the next generation. It asks what will keep the payments flowing. And the longer the timeline, the harder it is to see the cost. No one feels a 90-year debt all at once. They feel it as slightly higher taxes, slightly weaker currency, slightly more expensive housing, slightly delayed retirement, slightly less opportunity. Enough to hurt, not enough to revolt. That's why this model works. It doesn't rely on force. It relies on patience. Germany's final payment in 2010 didn't trigger celebration. There were no parades, no public relief. Most people didn't even notice. The system had already normalized the burden. The costs have been absorbed slowly, invisibly, across decades. And that's the most dangerous part. When a system succeeds in making long-term extraction feel normal, resistance disappears. People stop asking where the money goes. Stop questioning why the numbers never shrink. Stop imagining alternatives. Debt becomes background reality. But history shows something important. Empires don't collapse when they borrow once. They collapse when debt becomes structural, when repayment requires constant expansion, when future stability depends on perpetual growth in a finite world. At that point, the system doesn't need to fail dramatically. It decays. Currencies weaken. Trust erodes. Institutions lose legitimacy. And people sense something is wrong long before they can explain it. Germany's 92-year obligation wasn't just about money. It was a lesson in how long consequences can last when systems prioritize control over closure. And today, that lesson is being repeated globally, quietly, efficiently, and at a much larger scale. This isn't about panic. It's about awareness. Understanding that long-term debt is never neutral. It always reshapes power. It always shifts risk downward. And it always asks the future to clean up the present. Once you see that pattern, you start viewing the world differently. Headlines make more sense. Policy decisions feel less confusing. The constant reliance on borrowing stops looking like competence and starts looking like necessity. And when you understand a trap, you can at least recognize when you're being asked to walk deeper into it. If this helped you see the system with clearer eyes, stay close. We're going to keep breaking these patterns down, calmly, historically, and without noise. Because some traps don't snap shut. They just last long enough that people forget they're inside them.